So, after a 2-week break following the Australian Grand Prix, F1 makes its first of 2 trips to Italy, where for round 4 of the calendar the teams will be racing at the Imola Grand Prix, or to give it its more accurate title, the weekend of extremely long names, with cars on track at the Autodromo Internazionale Enzo Edino Ferrari and taking part in the Formula 1 Rolex Gran Premio del Made in Italy dell'Emilia Romagna 2022. And breathe. Coming into the weekend, it was Ferrari and Leclerc on top, with substantial leads in both the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships. This was as after 3 rounds it was clear that Max Verstappen's car had decided that one title fight was enough and that it wanted no part in 2022. Well, maybe a third of a part. Meanwhile, at the other end it was Aston Martin picking up the rear, as after Albon's tyre whispering last time out in Australia, the team sat dead last with no points. And thanks to numerous incidents across the weekend, coming into Imola they had more crashes under their belt than actual race weekends. Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to round 4 in Italy. Before we get going, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoy and subscribe down below for more F1 content every week with a variety of videos. I'm sure there's something you'll enjoy. Now with that out of the way, let's get into my honest review of Formula 1 and the 2022 Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. Now normally on every Monday, social media sees the barrage of It's Race Week plastered on every site, but this week it was a little different, as for the first time in 2022 there were posts with the It's Sprint Race Week tagline. This was of course because the weekend would accommodate F1's first sprint of the year, and in comparison to 2021 a couple of things had changed. First off, in an attempt to make more than just the first lap interesting, F1 had increased not only the number of points available but also the number of drivers that got them. So instead of 3 for first, 2 for second and 1 for third, the winner would receive 8 points and then a lower number all the way down to 8th place. And secondly, F1 has ditched its attempt to label the session sprint qualifying, given it's very clearly a race, and that in turn means that pole position goes to the driver setting the fastest time in Q3 during regular qualifying, which for those a bit less in the loop would be on a Friday. Other news included a story around Valtteri Bottas, where the Finn was asked about his new team and how he was finding it, his response being how amazing the porridge and coffee at Alfa Romeo is. I'm kidding, he didn't really, but he did say how happy he was to be at a place where, when he says something, people really listen, and in a role where he's not just a driver, but also an important team member. So given the amount of shade he's throwing at Mercedes, if I didn't know any better, I'd think he was Christian Horner. So on to Friday and what would be a crucial session to get the car set up, given qualifying would take place later that day. So ideally it would be nice and clear with optimal conditions to make life easier for the teams, but the Italian weather had other ideas. As for the first time this year we had some rain, well not just some rain, a lot of rain, with cars needing the full wets from the off. And with tricky wet conditions came mistakes, and plenty of them. First off the championship leader with Charles Leclerc spinning the car over the curbs at the Variante Alta chicane. A minute later it was Nicholas Latifi, the Canadian doing his best to imitate Lewis Hamilton and going off into the gravel at the Tosa hairpin. I guess at least this time he kept the car in one piece. Then back to Ferrari, and doing his best to keep up with his teammate Carlos Sainz took to the grass, but in the battle of which red car could make more mistakes, Leclerc was facing the wrong way again, this time getting on the curbs and white lines at Acqua Minerale, sending him into a spin, a sight that would become commonplace over the rest of the day. Another incident was drivers going off of the Ravazza gravel, with Norris, Ocon, Stroll and Magnussen all taking turns exploring the runoff. Finally getting to the second half of the session and the intermediate tyres were being tested out, with Charles Leclerc deciding to take them for a spin, quite literally. As for the third time in 40 minutes he was facing the wrong way, but luckily for him he avoided any damage and managed to top the times just a lap later. Into the last 5 minutes and we had not one but 2 incidents, first off Lando Norris getting on the curb and beaching in the gravel, or so we thought, as in perfect synchronisation with the red flag being brought out he rolled the car back onto the track, meaning that after just a short delay there were 3 minutes left in the session, which was just enough time for Valtteri Bottas to scare his mechanics as he became the latest Acqua Minerale victim, but just about managed to keep his car out the wall. Moving to qualifying in the afternoon, and to put it simply, Q1 was chaos. Starting with a damp track and a mix of tyre choices, some on softs but the Red Bulls and Mercedes going for the Inters. But they soon realised the dry line was there and would need the red tyres to set good lap times. Well, maybe for the Red Bulls, but the Mercs not so much. However, all of this early tyre testing wouldn't matter as we got a red flag caused by Williams that surprisingly wasn't Latifi's, as Alex Albon's rear right brake caught fire, melted and then caused the tyre to explode, leaving debris all over the place and giving the track a chance to unleash its army of marshals. Once the session got going, it wasn't long before another car was off, and this time it was Nicholas Latifi, spinning into the gravel before taking his frustration out on the nearby polystyrene board. Back to more competitive cars and it was getting close, the drying track helping to improve everyone's lap times, and getting to the last few minutes, things looked bad for Mercedes. I mean, that phrase does generally apply to their season as a whole, but in this session especially, as with cars getting faster, Hamilton was dropped into the bottom 5 twice before managing to scrape through by a mere 0.004 of a second, kicking out both AlphaTauris in the process. And going out with them were both Williams drivers, along with Esteban Ocon, who was unable to take advantage of the drying conditions due to a gearbox issue. At the start of Q2, it was the Ferrari radio giving cause for excitement, the engineers saying that there was time for just a single lap before the rain. And as it turned out, that was the case, as nobody got more than one lap in. But unfortunately for Ferrari, it wasn't just down to the rain, as Carlos Sainz was off at the final corner and into the wall, just when he really didn't need it, as this became the latest incident pushing him ever closer to becoming Ferrari's version of a Valtteri Bottas second driver. Now, given the rain started to fall again, nobody could improve, so while Sainz was going through to Q3, he'd start the sprint from 10th. Elsewhere, the subsequent red flag also had consequences, as at the time Russell was in 11th and Hamilton in 13th, meaning that for the first time since 2012, neither of the Mercedes cars made it into Q3. On to the last part of qualifying, and the drivers didn't wait long to bring out another red flag, this time Kevin Magnussen doing exactly what Bottas did just hours earlier, but he did keep it out the wall, and after completing a 20-point turn managed to get back on track. And with the Q2 rain shower gone, the track was drying up, with cars once again improving lap after lap. But that was short-lived, as this time it was the Alfa Romeo driven by Valtteri Bottas that was parked on the side of the road, and while the incident forced Verstappen to lift off, he still managed to take advantage of the track conditions, going fastest by 8 tenths and setting the fastest lap just seconds before the red flag for the stranded Alfa. A little later, after a truck ride for Valtteri, there were 3 minutes of the session remaining, but like most of the day, it was interrupted by a red flag, as once again a driver was off at Aqua Minerale. This time it was Lando Norris just pushing too hard in his outlap. But with the stoppage, the grid for the sprint was set, with Max Verstappen taking his first pole position of the year, followed up with Charles Leclerc in second, Norris in third, Magnussen in fourth, and Alonso in fifth, meaning that we had 5 different constructors in the top 5 places. Getting to Saturday in a session that usually with the sprint format is a bit irrelevant, as the vast majority of the car setup is locked in at the start of qualifying, but given the rain all through Friday, FP2 would be the only dry practice the teams would get. Well, all the teams except McLaren, as Daniel Ricciardo's car was in pieces for the entire session, meaning he managed a grand total of 0 laps. And then on the other side of the garage, it wasn't much better, with Lando Norris having to bring the car back in after 6 laps due to brake issues. And while some issues in practice aren't too surprising, come the end of the session, there was a surprise, as it was the Mercedes of George Russell topping the timesheet. So soak it in, George, it might be the only chance you get. On to the afternoon, and it was sprint time, with everyone except Latifi and the Haas cars using the soft tyres, but as Max Verstappen and Fernando Alonso found out, the softer rubber doesn't guarantee a great start, with the Red Bull driver falling back behind Leclerc and Alonso losing out to Ricciardo and Perez. Also struggling were both Mercedes, as Russell and Hamilton lost out on a pretty cramped opening lap, but none of those mentioned had as bad an opening lap as Zhou Guanyu, who after maintaining position in the early corners came together with Pierre Gasly, and while the Frenchman could carry on after repairing the car, Zhou and his Alfa Romeo, well, couldn't. After a few laps behind the safety car, it was time for a restart, where nothing really changed, but once the DRS was activated, we got some shuffling, with Magnussen in the Haas dropping back, not helped by the fact that his mediums were as effective as Man United's press. Someone making progress was Sergio Perez, who after qualifying 7th was making his way up to 3rd. Also improving his position was Carlos Sainz, the combination of a 2022 Ferrari behind slower cars and having DRS being as powerful as a snap of Thanos' fingers. Meanwhile at the front it was closing up, as after Leclerc had pulled a small gap, Verstappen was reeling him in, the Dutchman with much better tyre wear towards the end of the sprint, and that tyre advantage meant he could close up enough to pass down into turn 2, not turn 1 because apparently this is considered a corner. But the number doesn't really matter, as the pass left Verstappen as the winner of the sprint, with Leclerc set to start the race in 2nd and Perez in 3rd, picking up the final medal, the top 3 looking a little like if F1 did a school sports day. Getting to Sunday, and like qualifying, the main theme was rain. Luckily for F1 fans, it stopped before the race start, meaning we could breathe a sigh of relief knowing there wouldn't be a repeat of Spa last year. So on to the start, and at lights out, it was a good getaway for both Red Bulls, with Checo making his way into 2nd past a poor starting Leclerc, who by turn 2 had dropped back to 4th, but at least he was still on the track, which is more than could be said for his Spanish teammate, as through the opening corners it seemed Sainz and Ricciardo were back in the school playground, the McLaren driver playing tag with the Ferrari and sending Sainz spinning into the gravel, where the car was beached, meaning that the Tifosi who had waited since 2006 to see Ferrari's return to Imola were left in tears by the 3rd corner. With all the chaos ahead, a big gainer was George Russell, who had made his way from 11th up to 6th, also helped by the fact that without any prompting, Mick Schumacher became a slow revolving door out of turn 3. And while it looked like an innocent enough spin, once the safety car period finished, we found out that it actually wasn't, as his back wheel had hit the side pod of Fernando Alonso's Alpine, damaging the car and weakening the connection between the bodywork and the rest of the car, meaning that a few laps later, without warning, the blue and pink car turned itself into a slice of Swiss cheese, with the side pod flying off midway down the straight and eventually forcing him to retire. Then as the race went on, the track kept drying, with all the drivers looking for wet patches to help cool the intermediate tyres, and someone doing a good job of that was George Russell, who had closed up to Magnussen in front and made a nice move down the inside into the Variante outer chicane. Fast forward a few laps, and after finally giving up on more rain coming, teams started swapping to the dry tyres, with the first driver brought in being Daniel Ricciardo, who for this race had become McLaren's resident guinea pig, as after his lap 1 collision he was running around the back of the pack. But as is usually the case in the rain when one driver comes in, they all do, as over the next 2 laps it was chaos in the pit lane, with every car boxing for medium tyres. And someone losing out through all that was Lewis Hamilton, who came in 11th and by the end of it was 14th. Not helped by the Alpine crew, who by releasing Ocon straight into the Mercedes, basically created the perfect definition of an unsafe release. But for Hamilton, the places were lost, and so began what I can only assume were some of the most painful laps of his career, or as those not so keen on him would say, the best 60 minutes of their life, apart from maybe post Abu Dhabi last year. And the Brit wasn't helped by a lack of DRS, which despite dry tyres and a dry line wasn't activated until lap 34, as it seemed the race directors were taking longer to switch it on than James Cameron has taken to complete Avatar 2. And if you thought it was already bad enough, on lap 41 the pain got even worse, as Max Verstappen made his way by to lap his old championship rival, with Helmut Marko chiming in that when it comes to Hamilton, maybe he should have stopped last year, which funnily enough has been the thoughts of many F1 fans for the past decade when it comes to Marko and talking to the media. Moving back to the front, and Leclerc was still behind Perez, the Mexican keeping him at an arm's distance, so with no other options, Ferrari pitted Charles to see if Red Bull would follow, and they did. And while it didn't get Leclerc past Checo, it got him closer, and so now he could try to push and catch up to the back of the Red Bull, which he was doing until he wasn't, as too much curb on entry to the Variante outer chicane sent him spinning into the barrier, because clearly one Ferrari out of the race and the other down in 3rd place just wasn't enough pain for the Tifosi. The one saving grace being that the car wasn't damaged badly enough to force him out of the race. I mean, he did have to stop to change the front wing, and that dropped him down to 9th place, which isn't great, but it's still better than any position Hamilton got up to. But once repaired, with the Ferrari being as good as it is, he still managed to get back up to 6th. And ahead of him, things were getting close, as in one of the more ironic moments of the season, Bottas was catching Russell for 4th place. But he still had to overtake the Mercedes, and given he'd spent the last 5 years being told not to, he stuck to what he knew, as the Finn was unable to take that extra place. Then to finish off, right at the very front, it was Max Verstappen taking the win with Perez in 2nd, the team's first 1-2 since Hamilton's engine blew up in Malaysia 2016, though this time I think an engine failure may well have made his weekend better. And finally, on the 3rd step of the podium was Lando Norris, and given where they were in race 1, the teams made a comeback that Michael Jordan would be proud of. Anyways, that wraps up this video. Remember, if you haven't already, to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe if you do want to see some more F1 content. But until next time, take care.